Well, we are back now with Dr. Robert Eisenman, who is a professor emeritus from California State University, Long Beach, okay, who's a specialist in religious studies. And Dr. Robert Eisenman was my student. I was his student. I was Robert's student many, many decades ago at Long Beach State University. That's a reversal, that's right. Okay, he's quite a character. Dr. Robert Eisenman is editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He appears on TV all the time. He's on television this evening on channel Educational Television.
No, History Channel, the Nostradamus Effect, talking about the Dead Sea, the War Scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it could be wild, it could be idiotic. I have no control over its cutting.
Okay, but he's on television.
I know what I said, that's all.
Right, he's on television quite a lot, and he has many, many books. We brought some of those to show that he's really an expert in all these things. We've got, you want me to show?
You can show those. One,
okay, this is like the...
Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, and then James, the brother of Jesus.
Okay, we've got the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, uncovered, right? Because he was editing. Okay, we've got his very famous book, James, the Brother of Jesus, which I've read to some extent. I find it quite long. Okay, but I also listen to his lectures, etc., over the years on these topics. We have the New Testament Code. Okay, and then we have several other books of yours, right?
Yeah, we have, this book was written about the scroll struggle by the authors who wrote the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was ripped off by Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code, but they also did one called the Dead Sea Scroll Deception.
Okay.
This was about our work at Cal State Long Beach.
Dead Sea Scroll Deception.
That's good enough for the moment.
Okay.
You know, a book of poetry I did, an anti-beat on the road from the late 50s, early 60s. When I was in Paris and on the road to India, and, on the road internationally. I wanted to get it out. It came out last year from Atlantic Books, and we were quite happy about that.
Okay. On top of which...
Yep.
Okay. On top of which Robert has done... he goes to these archaeological digs through Israel, etc., for the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I was invited several years ago to accompany a whole group of students, right? Students?
All right.
Okay, as well as, I'm a faculty member, but I can still go because I used to be a professor of religious studies at Long Beach State. And
you didn't come.
I didn't come.
You
it was
missed
cost a bit of money, dinero,
No, it
teachers.
didn't. We paid for you.
Really? Mm-hmm. Well, next time, for sure. Let's
paid
go.
For teachers, that's for sure.
Well, see, I missed it. I didn't see that one. And that
what are we looking at, that one or this one?
Now we're looking at number 2, straight ahead.
Looking at number 2.
So, well, you've got the impression that Robert has written many books, many more books than I have. I just have that little critical thinking book out with Doug. But I've got a lot of articles. So you've written a lot of books, and one of the things that we were discussing in this chapter was religious relativism, which I treated briefly. But another one, and it's a major concern today, is religious absolutism. Might you, off the top of your cuff, have something to say about this in fundamentalism, extremism?
Well,
dogmatism?
in our field, it's a good example.
Right.
In the Dead Sea Scrolls field, and which I'm somewhat known for and have been involved in, and the formation of early Christianity, Christian origins in Palestine. It turns out religious studies is a very odd field. The only people who go into it are often ex-priests, ministers, rabbis, things like that. People who have a religious commitment, they may not be honoring it so much, but it's there in the background. And a lot of people in this field are really under authority. They are not able to go beyond a certain point. So where the scrolls went, they couldn't go beyond saying, oh, these are sort of antecedents of Christianity. These couldn't have been what Christianity was in Palestine before it went overseas. So their ability, being under authority, they could only go that far. Mm-hmm. And the scrolls, therefore, were pushed way, way back into a time so that they had to be pre-Christian, because in their minds there would have to be both Christian and rabbinic minds. Muslims didn't get involved in this. There had to be a Christianity in Palestine. It was impossible that they could conceive there wasn't a Christianity in Palestine. There was just this apocalyptic militanism in Palestine, and that Christianity was created overseas. That was and retrospectively put back into Palestine. They could not go that far, and therefore we had a sort of curia of minds that controlled the Dead Sea Scroll studies, the interpretation of the scrolls, and that's what you mean by absolute religious authority. These people, as liberal as they might felt they were under authority.
Right, and therefore they're very dogmatic.
And their minds sometimes weren't dogmatic. They couldn't go beyond a certain point, because at that point, like a Muslim would to some extent be, he or she could go up to a certain point, but there are certain things they wouldn't or couldn't say on pain of death, actually.
That's right.
They would be in serious trouble. We as non-Muslims maybe can go a little further, but even we found we can't go beyond a certain point in some people's view. But they couldn't go beyond a certain point, and that's where the absolutism kicks in. You can talk what you want within the tradition itself, but then suddenly the tradition becomes absolute.
And then you fail to really look at the complexity, the contradictions, the history, the evidence, and the reasons being given.
And those people who are into relativism, you see, they say, oh, we've chucked it all off, we're just look at everything in a comparative way. But getting into a relative situation, those people who are in that kind of mindset, they don't know enough about the religions themselves to know what the religions themselves were saying or were involved in or emphasizing, so their view isn't much better than the ones who are under an absolute control. So you're really in a difficult situation. What you need is knowledgeable, secular, objective people who know everything they can possibly know about all of the traditions we're talking about. They may be in a position to draw some conclusions, comparisons, and judgments.
And you need to have an honest approach towards history, because all these religions come through with documents as well as rituals and traditions, and you need to be able to look at those documents with an open mind and understand that they are translations. They were written for a particular audience at a particular time in a particular historical context, often with a political agenda, right? I mean,
with a religious, political, and spiritual agenda.
A religious, political, and spiritual agenda.
Look, you've just hit on something that's a favorite bugaboo of mine. It took me a long time to discover this, because I came to Cal State Long Beach and into basically what was Jesus country. It's not so much that now, but back in the 70s, that's what it was. As an outsider, and this was like almost Alice in Wonderland to me. I never seen a world like this. But the point was, it became very clear to me that the people I was dealing with, and this tends to be in all religions, they cannot distinguish between religion and literature, or rather history and literature. For them, the literature is history. So they can't see, oh, this is a literary document like Greek tragedy. They can't say their documents are like a Greek tragedy written by someone for a certain end. We can say that about the Greeks, but we're not going to say that about the Jews, Christians, and Muslims and others. Their literature is history. But the point of the matter is, it really isn't history. And it's very rarely history. It's only occasionally history. And that mistake between unable to distinguish between those two things is something upon which many of these issues founder.
Right, we find that both in Christianity and in Judaism and in Islam.
All across the board. I'm sure it exists in Buddhism too.
Yes. The
inability to distinguish between, sitting under the bodhisattva tree and a fruit or something falls on his head. These become historical moments in the Christian Gospels, which are considered to be historical by the person within a religious institution. Huge amounts of the Pax Romanum, Pauline theology, Greek mystery cult religion, almost everything you can imagine has bled backwards into it in a retrospective manner. But the practitioner is not aware of that and can't even come to grips with that. Right. I had a professor at college, just like you did. And he was wonderful. One thing, he turned out to be in the end a conservative, religious, Catholic Christian. But at the time I knew him at college, he was a free thinker. He went the other way. But what he used to say, and it stuck in my mind, he taught literature, is literature was truer than history. And what he meant by that, I always say, what can he mean? What's that mean? Literature is truer than history. What he meant by that, it's not what did happen that matters. It's what people think happens that matters. And this is usually presented in the form of religious texts of one kind or another.
Right, and then what they often do, I've noticed in certain Christian studies, is they don't even understand the context in which the text was written, and therefore they may actually not recognize there are battles that are heretical battles that are going on, because there's subtleties and there are nuances and there are contradictions, and therefore they take over dogmatic positions that actually are heretical or in conflict with the actual traditions. So for example, perhaps, okay, the notion that, well, Jesus died to forgive your sins. Well, that wasn't necessarily an original understanding of the death of Jesus. It was taken over in many ways hundreds of years later, then inserted as that's why there was the crucifixion, and all these layers then built up around the death of Jesus, which are distorting it, or the mind-body dualism that came down through Gnosticism.
Well, you see, there you go again.
Yeah.
Because, like a Ronald Reagan statement, there you go again. You see, even what you say has assumed there is a Jesus. You know, this is not what Jesus necessarily says. First, you see, the historian has to get to the point of proving there was a, quote, Jesus, and not just a abstract spiritual ideal personified, like the Greeks personified wisdom in Athena or enlightenment in Apollo. Here we have a salvationary figure with the name salvation. In Hebrew, Yeshua means salvation. So is this a concept personified in all perfection that they were trying to write in the, not in the Judaic manner, but in the sort of Greco-Roman manner?
Hellenistic.
So first you have to decide, are we dealing with someone historical? And most people don't even get back to that point, and you've already assumed that in what you say. So this is where absolutism kicks in, and I'm not against it. Let me explain why I'm not against it ultimately. First of all, people live very short lives. People are only conscious in their waking life perhaps from about the age of, if we can be fair, 19, 20, till about, before their mind begins to go downhill, 55, 60. So basically, if they're lucky, they're going to have 30 or 40 years of consciousness. What can any creature really be expected to absorb in 30 or 40 years? Particularly someone who's not even working at absorbing anyone. So people need something, because life is tough. Life is full of trial and sadness and dislocation. People need something on which to rely, and that has usually been considered to be religion. So I don't want to deconstruct anyone's religion. But in a university where we're going to study these things, then we got to ask these serious questions. In the church, the mosque, the synagogue, go do your absolute religious duty, whatever you or solidarity system you are a part of. Practice it, because it's going to save you a lot of stern and drang throughout the rest of your life, and fortify you in moments of great crisis. But in an intellectual way, which Robin and I are talking about, then you have to meet the challenges we're discussing.
Right, but there's another thing though. When people buy into religious absolutism, they buy into it not just in terms of their own personal life or their community, but in the way they act in society, in the way they vote, in their politics, etc. And so, particularly in this century, the 21st century, we've seen a lot of problems with religious extremism. That it's not just these people have their beliefs, okay, but whether they vote or whether they become terrorists, or their attitudes towards women or whatever, there are huge consequences to their belief systems, because they're not really looking at reason or how they're being controlled or manipulated by those authorities that they so trust and believe in. I'm
not sure we've had any more problems in the present than they've had in the past. They've been publicized more because people like to rivet in on the abortion and anti-abortion people, and different aspects of the medical practice world and so on and so forth. But I think that maybe because we've become more aware of it in the media, then we think that is more now than people used to be. But in the old days, they were just under authority without telling anyone. So they were, they would just do what the authority told them anyway without publicizing it. So I'm not sure it's any more. And take the Islamic world with, this is something new in Islam to have, you know, suicidal terrorist bombs for the good of the revolution or for the change or the furtherment of Islam. This is a modern phenomenon, but it does go way back into the roots of Islam, back in the early parts of the struggle with the Crusaders. You had these terrorist sort of people who would literally commit suicide in assassinating people, and they were called the assassins. So these situations have been there for, you know, centuries, maybe millennia, and I don't think that even in our poor discussion here, we're going to even make a dent in it.
Well, no, but it is a concern because in terms of self-awareness, you need to be aware. Look, if you see all these things going on with other people, maybe you yourself have bought into certain kinds of religious absolutism or religious relativism, which as critical thinkers, I'd like my students to be thinking about.
Well, that's your duty as a university teacher to teach critical thinking. Fair enough. That doesn't mean it's going to take for more than 6 months or 2 years or 5 if you're lucky. And people are in the end, something like you were saying, the Hume people said, are going to go back to their knee-jerk reactions in which they were born, and particularly as they get older, it's known, and people admit that they go back to being what they were when they were young. So, I mean, it would be arrogance on our part to think that we're really affecting anyone very deeply, except one or two people here and there who gets really deeply into these matters. But I think the rank and file are hardly touched by what we attempt to convey.
What we attempt, keep our humility
Can I just
here.
have that book, Michael?
Yes,
Put it over here.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, the same thing occurs, of course, with the discussion of ethics. I can sit here and talk blue in the face about the different ethical theories and what being a good person is and conscience and moral deliberation and using reason. But whether people decide to become ethical or not is, I mean, Hume is right in many ways. People simply learned it. It's a matter of their culture, their society. It's, of course, survival. It's a matter of how they feel. How much people reason is really not something that characterizes many people, that they reason things through. Okay, but we hope so, because part of the commitments of the Enlightenment were that we would use some reason now and then to decide ethical, political issues, as well as religion.
But you're mixing something up here. You see, you're telling people what the Enlightenment was and what the different streams of thinking that went into it and came out of it and influenced further ones. But you're thinking that by telling people these things, you're going to influence them at the moment in some manner. That, I think, is a conceit. The only thing you can hope for is to tell people what there was, what happened, and what came out of it. But you can't think this is going to have any effect on anyone's mind at the moment that you're touching. Maybe it has effect on some people, but you seem to want to say, well, if I give them these things, then they'll be able to better evaluate where they are and so on and so forth. I think that's pretty much of a hobgoblin. I don't think it's going to be.
Well, some people do have certain commitments to the Enlightenment still to this day, right? And
have you met some people like that?
Well, people generally talk about equality and things
well, maybe
like that.
because you inhabit a philosophical world and I'm more in a historical, religious world. I never hear people speak about any of these things.
Okay.
So there's a small minority of people in the world that you've encountered that are still talking in these terms, which is really nice to know. There's some fossils still out there, talking in that way. But most of the people I hear, they sort of more talk like Ronald Reagan. Like, there you go again, or isn't life wonderful?
I have a select group of friends who are very interested in philosophy and also ethics and politics and economics.
That's abnormal.
And in Karl Marx.
That's
abnormal.
Lots of discussions you just rescued Karl Marx from all the sins that have been attributed to him. You did it in one sentence. I was really impressed by that.
Well, thank you. Yes.
I was going to ask you, of course, all this beautiful Hegelian thought that you were outlining there. I mean, what happened to some of his descendants in Germany? Hitler, what, they forgot to read Hegel, did they? No, not Hegel, Kant. I'm talking about Kant, all this elegant Kant thought. They missed their Kantism in the university. It's really quite shocking that the homeland of all these great moral imperatives, or whatever you categorical imperatives you were talking about, should have forgotten the basic essence of them.
Well, that's what Jean-Paul Sartre's criticism was, okay? Is that these people were in bad faith, that they simply acted like machines or tools of the state, okay? And then they went around and did all these terrible things saying, I'm not responsible, it wasn't my choice, I'm not free, I was just being a good German,
Yeah,
or I didn't see anything.
They applied the imperatives in the wrong direction.
They applied the imperatives in the wrong direction.
But no, take our friend Sartre now. Oh, Mr. Perfection, Mr. Sartre. But you know, anyone who could be duped by Stalinism for even a short time in the way he was shows a distinct lack of critical thinking.
I agree with that.
You know, come on, look, Stalin. Here you're having thugs running a country, you know, murderous thugs. I've always said that the Russians were fortunate to have Stalin because they were more frightened of Stalin than they were of Hitler. So they fought to the last man, not so much because they were frightened of Hitler, because they were frightened to death of Stalin. Right. But in any case, he just threw the fear of death into them even worse than Hitler might have done. But still, I don't consider that any excuse. I understand today Putin's going back to lionizing Stalin, so it looks like we're going back to the beginning again.
That's right.
The more we learn, the less we know.
Right. It's almost as if in a culture there's like a collective unconscious.
Very pessimistic age that we're looking into at the moment.
Right, and in that sense very different from the optimism of the Enlightenment.
And no categorical imperatives seem to be helping us.
No, okay. I mean, we do.
I would like you to preach some categorical imperatives out there in Iran or some of these other, and I wish we would get maybe some of the al-Qaeda folks and some of these other folks and teach them a bit of this, and we might be making some progress, but I don't think we're going anywhere at the moment.
No, I know, and that's actually rather scary because so many people are coming into whatever they're getting exposed to in their cultures are becoming more radicalized and made more extreme, and our own foreign policy probably isn't helping that any. So
I wouldn't say I wouldn't put all the guilt on America. I think America tries whatever administration. I mean, whether you like one or the other. I mean, frankly, I think Roosevelt tried. I think Truman tried. You know, I can't speak for Carter. He was kind of peculiar. But I think even if you don't like Reagan, Reagan tried. I think, you know, I don't know about Nixon. He was an oddball too. But, you know, I think that Clinton tried. You know, I think Bush in his own way, not Papa Bush as much as Junior Bush tried, but just didn't have the intellectual apparatus to do anything. And I think obviously Obama is going to be trying, but that doesn't mean anything is going to be, you know, effective in the end.
Right, well, because you've also got the history of these people to deal with, and you can't simply overcome their history.
So I don't think it's our fault the way the world is. I mean, we've probably tried more than any other nation on earth to get it right, and we rarely seem to have gotten it right.
We don't seem to be doing too good a job, that's right.
Well, I mean, we've done better than most. I mean, we did stop this thing that was rising in World War II and World War I. I mean, we had problems in the Korean and the Vietnam situation because we did lose our moral imperative, our guidance. You know, we weren't clear on these things, and I think that produced a whole generation of music, beatniks. I was just watching a biography of Joan Baez, and she describes her whole life and all these struggles. Really interesting, you know, which created a whole mental strain in our culture from the 60s to 2000, and that really has caused a real hindrance in trying to figure out what the American you know, bright outlook used to be. Now it's all a dark, pessimistic outlook.
Yes, I would say
so. And it shouldn't necessarily be.
It shouldn't necessarily be, because that becomes then a self-fulfilling philosophy,
That's
a prophecy.
That's what it is, yeah.
Right, and so if you start going around and saying, well, the government's totally messed up, therefore do away with the government, then you continue this cycle of incompetence and corruption and failure, because that's what you expect. You also become apathetic and you give up on doing anything because you say, well, it doesn't matter.
Even in the Depression, when you look back, and all of our parents, I know my parents were Depression people and so on, they still had this basic optimism, which is so amazing when you think of what the Depression must have been like for most of the people. But now we're going through this particular phase here, and all you see is pessimism everywhere. You know, it's like okay, something has reversed itself. The banks haven't done their job. The government hasn't done their job. You know, people were, you know, making money in a glittering age. But that doesn't mean that there's no optimism out there, that we shouldn't have an optimism for the ideals of what this country represents. Like you were talking about, I forget who came before Tocqueville, but like someone was saying, I guess it was Kant admiring English government. Well, Tocqueville was
Well, and
obviously
Montesquieu.
he was a Kantian who came to the U.S. or America at that time and wanted to find out what the Americans had to offer, and then found that this was the ideal system because it was purely egalitarian.
Right, and actually after the American Revolution, that made a very big impression on a number of people, and they started the French Revolution, of course, the
sure.
Haitian Revolution, and then,
Absolutely.
and then, of course, eventually that even led to the Russian Revolution. I mean, there's a connection philosophically with the ideals of each of these
But I
periods.
don't think the Russians got what they bargained for.
No, they didn't.
Because I don't think the Russians really were into this extreme, what was it called? What was the name? Bolshevism.
Right.
That finally managed through cleverness and maybe some help from the German opponents to, in other words, to bring the Russians out of the war. To get that in there in place, and it was more ruthless than the other kinds. I think the Russians were really looking for a liberal, progressive democracy.
That's right.
And they got,
that's what they wanted.
And they got what we now can see is a really almost a thugism on the other side of the coin to German Nazism. It's a weird form of autocratic. It's not Nazism as such, but it's a weird form of some form of totalitarian thugism.
Capitalism now, yeah.
Well,
State capitalism, then privatized capitalism.
So now it's thug capitalism.
That's right, it's thug capitalism.
Yeah.
And besides that...
And we can't necessarily stand up to that. The reason we can't stand up to that is that they, having a platonic dictatorship, if you like, and a dictatorship of the philosopher thug kings, they can see where everything should be and direct it all, where we have to look what's going on in Medicare at the moment in the Congress, the medical debate. We have to go through all these excruciating debates between all people that differ from each other in the slightest manner. They end up pulling themselves apart in two houses of Congress. Then they have to reconcile. Then the president has to get involved. This system is so cumbrous, it may not be able to stand up to the challenge that these totalitarian regimes like
China,
Russia, right, and Islamic Caliphate, should it ever develop, a capitalistic Islamic Caliphate, capitalistic communist government in China. We may not be able, as a freewheeling entrepreneuring capitalism, to stand up to them, and that's where your Enlightenment philosophers might help us out.
How?
Give us the reason to reason our way through these tremendously difficult problems.
Yeah. Okay, because there are...
And it's way out of my scope. I'm just talking off the top of my head here, as you know.
Well, there are some very deep concerns
I'm depending on you to lead the conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. My goodness, I'm the woman that leads.
Well, I always told all of my friends that I
make
introduced you to Nietzsche. I and another
colleague,
colleague, yes. And you are the perfect Nietzschean. The only difference is that for Nietzsche, that stupid quote, he had this silly thing where he said, "When thou goest to women, carry thy whip." I think you've just reversed that. When they goest to men, carry thy whip.
We're the ones with the whip.
You guys have the whip hand, and Nietzsche would be quite happy with that because I think he really liked being under the female whip. Actually.
I think so too, and even in that photograph with Lou Salome.
Yeah. Did you hear how he died, by the way, or how he went finally crazy?
Well, he hugged a horse.
Yeah, which I sympathize. Some fellow on streets of Turin or someplace like that was whipping a horse.
That's right.
And then he ran up and took the horse in his arms and started crying.
And compassion.
Well, that's lovely because I was disagreeing with your presentation while I was listening to it, where you were talking about the Enlightenment and about men and women, of course, all equal and so on, and being concerned about whether it's good for men and women. What about animals? The people's treatment of animals have to be brought in. Are they
Absolutely.
kind? Are they kind and humane? And not only humane by putting them to death. Right. I mean, are they humane in treating these poor creatures that are at our total mercy in a tender, compassionate way?
That's right.
I judge people often on how I see them with animals.
Right. Well, Martha Nussbaum, the great philosopher of these days, she has a whole book out on Kant and on Rawls, on the theory of justice, and deals with the problem of animal rights, environmental rights, and the rights of the disabled. So she said Kant and many of these people really never even took this into consideration.
Yeah. Did they care about animal suffering? That's all. I mean, because animals are like people used to be considered. You know, the lower class groups, I don't say they're like animals, but they had no rights whatsoever, and they were completely at the mercy of the upper classes. Now most of the classes have a little bit of leeway, but animals are totally dependent upon us, at least the ones who have been domesticated
right.
ones, and even the wild ones.
And the wild ones.
And we have such an obligation to these poor creatures, and I don't find that people are fulfilling this obligation.
Right, and what, as I said, her book is about, of course, it's from a deontological...
So I understand Nietzsche crying at the man beating the horse.
Nietzsche was crying because of the man
That's the
beating
most
the horse.
noble thing I think he did.
Okay, so deontology then is being extended today in certain circles, like Martha Nussbaum's work, and she's very famous as a classicist. Okay, in terms of animal rights, okay, along with the rights she was concerned about environmental issues, as well as, of course, the rights of the disabled, because many times we don't take that into consideration. When we are talking about human rights, we're talking about people that we think are free, autonomous, rational, self-motivating, self-determining, etc. Well, not everybody, from children to the very old, okay, have that capacity, and some people are never going to have that capacity.
Well, I disagree with you there a little bit when we say we, because I do think this country has shown itself more sensitive to that issue than almost any other country in the world that I've ever traveled and seen. Because if you want to go to some of these other countries, the disabled are not even a category of consideration, whereas here people at least try to think in those terms. So honestly, there's a little bit too much self-flagellation going on in this country. We do this wrong, we do that wrong. If we talk of all man and womankind, fine, but it's just not. I think America is at the forefront of seeking out helping the disabled rights. Again, I'm talking off the top of my head. I don't know Sweden, and I don't know some of these advanced modern societies like that, but I think America does pretty well in attempting to face up to these things.
Yes, and partly because deontology...
Not animal rights. Though.
Not animal rights. Deontology, et cetera, is a fairly popular philosophy that we do teach in universities, and...
That's the first I've ever heard of it here on this program.
Deontology...
So I guess they don't teach it in my university.
I'm not, well, no, they wouldn't in that philosophy
They
department.
never taught it at Cornell when I was there either, which was a logical positivist philosophy department.
That's right, that's right. There is a problem with those that learn a little bit of philosophy is a dangerous thing.
Yeah,
that's right. So that's a problem with some schools. But not here at Cal State Dominguez. We actually specialize in the history of philosophy and in continental philosophy, and we also have a minor in religious studies. So,
oh, you guys are on the cutting edge.
We are, including with this studio.
This is fine. When I came here, I thought I was in elegance compared to what I've seen in other Cal State campuses.
Yeah,
I mean, the lowest I've seen is at Fullerton, and then Cal State is Long Beach is a little above that. But you guys are living in luxury here in Dominguez Hills. You should congratulate yourself.
Yes, thank you, thank you. And we really do have a very strong department in the history of philosophy. So when I'm bringing up these things like extending deontology, as you said, to animal rights, okay, and in our courses and things like that, these issues are certainly discussed. We're not just logical positivists sitting there analyzing our navels, right? We're going into ethical issues about women and religion. Okay?
But what concerns me is that you've never mentioned yet, from what you've said, and the person that Bertrand Russell called everything being a footnote to him, all philosophy being a footnote to Plato.
That was Whitehead.
You sure it wasn't Bertrand Russell?
I don't know. Bertrand Russell doesn't say too much that was very good about the history of philosophy.
Bertrand Russell said it too, but
well,
anyway.
Whitehead may have quoted Whitehead.
One maybe ripped off the other.
That's right.
We don't know.
That was Whitehead.
We don't know. It was also Russell. Russell
right.
Definitely. In fact, I'll take you at gentleman's best that Russell was known in the literature to said it before him.
Okay. Yes. All.
You see, no one's ever heard of Whitehead. That's the problem. Only you guys know about Whitehead.
That's right. I do
teach
Whitehead.
You ask the public at large who Whitehead is, they'll say, who? Is this Blackbeard or something? But if you say Bertrand Russell, they'll all mostly have heard of him.
Right.
So I would think that most people would have attributed that to Bertrand Russell, and maybe Whitehead was ripped off by Bertrand Russell. However, let's go back to the whole point. What about Plato? Now, he started this whole mess. I mean, he started it all. And there have been some deconstructions of Plato that have gone on. I forget that famous modern contemporary writer that really just took an axe to Plato and considered him ultimately a fascist. But
you're not talking about Derrida, right?
No,
you're
not
talking
Derrida.
about
No, I'm talking about another one. But honestly, I do feel that most of religious thought that we're familiar with moved into Neoplatonism, and the Neoplatonism moved into what we call Christianity. And so, you say, what, Jesus was a Neoplatonist? No, first, forget Jesus. We got to first discuss the historical Jesus to determine that problem.
Right.
But the problem is that the people who wrote about Jesus presented him in a Neoplatonic manner.
Right.
And that's really important to develop into, because Plato thought in terms of absolutes, and one of his beautiful
universals,
and
universals.
one of his beautiful, and he was a religious philosopher, and he was basically the first. And if you consider Socrates, who didn't write, we can't speak about him because of that. But Plato was one of the first. But one of the first things he did, which really bothers me, although maybe he's correct, he wanted to bar the poets from the Republic, which was the ideal state. Because why? Because in his cave imagery, all of us living like we're in the movie theater, chained in a cave with images on the wall, and only the philosophers see the truth and they go out and see the light. The poets built the myths by which the average person lived, and for him this was a world of almost total darkness. So this is, to me, where I agree with Bertrand Russell or Whitehead on that, where all things philosophical tend to start.
Well, Whitehead actually probably goes through and actually is one thinker in terms of religion, because he's involved in process philosophy, process theology, where he doesn't get trapped either in the relativism or in the absolutism. And so a lot of my students, when I get them through Whitehead,
God,
really,
you are probably the only person in the universe teaching Whitehead in any consistent manner. I mean, this is actually incredible virtue.
Actually, my chair also teaches some Whitehead.
Well, that's not fair. That's sort of like, incest. We're not talking about incest. We're talking about the world at large, not your little department here at Dominguez Hills. Tell me some other departments that are teaching Whitehead as a principal thinker.
No, I'm afraid.
No, that's very rare. Maybe Gertrude Stein might.
Yeah. There are many. There probably.
Gertrude Stein, your audience may not know, was one of Whitehead's favorite students.
Oh, okay.
Don't you remember that famous story about Gertrude Stein?
When she was dying?
No, when she was in his class and she wrote, "I don't feel like writing today," and he said, "Oh," and handed in the exam. I think it was Whitehead, but I think it was him. He said, "Oh, that's all right, my dear. I understand how you feel. I've often felt that way myself." A.
Aha, I didn't know that little anecdote.
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, you're right, back to Plato. Plato sets it all up by saying that what he needed was universal truths, universal morality, something that would transcend society, that was not relative simply to one system.
And these influence all Western thought anyway,
right.
Thereafter. But that is not biblical thought. And
right,
that's
it's not
Muslim thought.
That's right.
But you see, the problem with Christianity is simply that they consider themselves part of biblical thought in the way that Muslims are part of a Quranic thought. But no, they missed the Platonic aspect of the tradition that they represent. And Augustine makes that clear, and others. But the point is that, yes, he set this up, but the Bible now, and Quran and other documents of that kind, they have this view of the world that I think, and also the Scripture and Christianity to some extent too, that, if you live like this, you're going to go into this heavenly existence in some manner. And they lay it out in a literary manner, all of what is required to some extent that you be and do. And if people hold on to that, even if they're all going to die and turn into rotten bones, at least in the last moment when they're dying, they're going to think that they're actually going to get to what's been promised them, which is very comforting. I don't know if that's right, but life is so short and so fragile that it really helps them get through it.
Yes, I'm sure that it does, but there are other traditions too. So one of the things, in order to
How does Sartre help you get through your life?
So, no, Sartre was
You think Hegel's going to get you through your life? I mean, you think Kant's going to get you through your life? My mother went to college and she studied philosophy. I don't think she learned a thing. Bless her soul, she died recently at 101.
Yes,
but the only thing she always said, what'd you learn at college, Mom? She said, "I can't stand Kant."
Kant. Kant, it's German. So
Yeah.
I can't stand Kant.
I can't stand Kant.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we all make little jokes occasionally about
That
Kant.
was all she knew about Kant.
Well, he actually is a major.
Or Schopenhauer, it was, The ding on zist, the ding on, that's all she ever learned.
Everything, Kant represents what we call the anthropological turn, where that is, philosophy moved from being theocentric, God-centered, right, to being human-centered. So we could say there were early stages of philosophy, like the Greeks, which were cosmological. And then, of course, with the rise of Christianity throughout the Middle Ages, philosophy was primarily theological, theocentric. And then gradually we get the scientific revolution, which very much is influencing the Enlightenment. Okay? And then we get humanism, okay, from many sources, right, from the Renaissance as well. And then we get this change of ideals of what it means to be human and the definition of human nature, and what is right and what is wrong, and what is a good society and what is not a good society, based on these commitments of the Enlightenment, which changed the world. I mean, it did.
Well, certainly the Enlightenment brought about the changes in Europe that you were documenting in the 1700s, the 18th century, you know, starting really in the 1600s and with Hobbes and others like that. And they brought about this world. But you see, what they've done is something quite frightening in certain ways. Because though everything that makes perfect sense and sounds reasonable and sounds like it ought to be, and all these rights should be respected, there are some things that have occurred, like the death of colonialism. That's a bad thing. But what has happened? All of this mess that we encounter between, you know, natural resources and inflation and holding people hostage, you know, the colonial systems had that all worked out, right or wrong. And then finally, the other thing that has occurred, you know, the fact that democracy has been thrust on countries that are culturally not at a level where democracy can function or should have been introduced without some paternalism first. Well, what happened in Germany after the First World War? Democracy produced Hitler, you see, because you will get these megalomaniacs, Mussolini, Hitler, present-day Putin and people like that, Chavez in Venezuela, rising out of the mass because they have a charismatic being about them, and the democracy doesn't necessarily solve the world's problems. Maybe kind of enlightened Platonism might help. Might.
What about in the countries such as the Palestinians and Lebanon? Okay, they have democracies of a sort, and then all of a sudden you wind up with terrorists.
No, democracy, you can't even speak in those countries yet because they don't have the institutions. Look at Iraq, the problems we're having in Iraq. To develop an institution that will ensure anything. The same thing in Russia. There are no institutions, no checks and balances. These people don't realize, you don't just throw democracy into these countries. It takes 2 centuries for the institutions in which democracy can be, you know, controlled to survive. I mean, people like Hamilton and Washington really did have a horror of the masses. They didn't think the masses could actually produce an intelligible government, and I'm not sure they can in the end.
In the end, yes.
But that's besides the point.
Originally,
Plato wouldn't have liked it, that's for sure.
Plato certainly wouldn't have liked it. Aristotle was the one that defended a limited democracy, but it was a very limited democracy.
But the medieval philosophy is a footnote to Aristotle, but Bertrand Russell or Whitehead's philosophy is a footnote to Plato.
It's a footnote to Plato, as has been the entire history of philosophy. And that's when we get these certain commitments, as we said, to universal ethics, to norms, mind-body dualism often, some things where this world doesn't count and this life is just preparation for the next.
Right.
Those kinds of attitudes came out of Plato. They came out of Plato, and then they were absorbed into religions.
Neoplatonism and so on.
Right, and attitudes about sex and the body and art, as you said. Okay, many of these sort of historical prejudices, as Nietzsche would say. Okay.
So shall we go back to your theme that you wanted to finish with, religion?
Yes, what is it you wanted to go back to?
What did you want to sum up in this religious issue?
Well, a number of the things was, I think today people are very concerned about this problem of religious absolutism. Okay, it doesn't mean that you have to then turn around and become a religious relativist or necessarily an atheist or agnostic or a Stalinist. Okay, but you need to be able to, we would like you to use reason to look at religion historically, to look at it in terms of poetry, metaphor, literature, these various ways of evaluating religion, so that you don't wind up in these gross misconceptions that we see so prevalent today.
Well, look, really, aside, and we don't want to be cruel to Islam per se, but aside from the way Islam is going at the moment, where else do you see this religious absolutism? Maybe some right-wing organizations in this country.
In this country.
But they're not that powerful. You know, okay, Vatican machinations perhaps, but you know, that's just popular religion. It's not that it's going to take over and govern anything. They don't have a majority voice,
right,
as far as I can see. So I don't think absolutism is occurring except as a fear factor in our society, to the extent that you seem to be implying.
Well, I certainly think this happens when you see how the way people vote, that they often simply vote on one issue, and all other issues with respect to politics, economics,
that's not just
government.
The religious right.
Yeah.
I mean, the church too is very, very big. You wouldn't call them the religious right. Very big on some key issues.
Some key issues, and ignoring some of their other key issues.
Yeah, and that's not a right wing, because they have a constituency that goes all across the Hispanic world and other parts of the society. So.
Right. And then you have to think of when the Islamic nations, they're also reacting to the colonial period, okay? So there's a whole history of why they're so reactive. After all,
well, you know, they can react to the colonial period, but they've always been colonial themselves. When they can get a colonial on someone, they start the colony situation themselves. I would like to throw one other thing about this. It isn't history; it's what people believe happened, not what actually happened. I love to throw out the thing of DNA. For instance, you hear in Islamic thought, "Oh, we're all sons of Abraham." Jews may have the same problem, but let's leave them aside at the moment.
Right.
But we're from Ishmael and so on. So the Muslims end up over 2 centuries conquering the whole world, the southern Mediterranean, from basically India all the way to Spain, you know,
right,
and they amalgamate these peoples, particularly the North African tribes and everyone else. And then you hear Muslims in North Africa and every place else saying, "We're sons of Abraham." But it may turn out that your ancestors actually were against Islam.
That's right.
But you've forgotten their literature. You've now absorbed the new one. If I took your DNA, I'm sure you would turn out to be a Greek or a Berber or some other, not a son of Abraham, if we can even speak of that. So this is where, you know, where literature trumps history. People even absorb the literature of their opponents, you know, the ones who their parents may have fought against, and 3 generations down, then they are the dominant world. So that's what I find frightening about religious absolutism.
Yes. Okay. Well, we're almost
at mythology.
Yes, I know. We're almost at a conclusion, and of course, I guess the thing.
You're the concluder.
I am the concluder.
I'm just the enfant terrible troublemaker.
All right. I think the concern is that religious neurosis at times, not necessarily that it has to be, but it can be very dangerous, and we'd like reason to help us out if possible. Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have. And you can always rewatch my television shows and come here to take classes at Cal State Dominguez with me, or any of my other faculty. You won't be around, but I will be. All right, I hope.
I'm not dead yet.
You're not dead?
I teach 1 course a year at Cal State.